It's hard to talk about Yemen these days without mentioning the war, the bombings, the hunger, the Houthis. Yet this is a country of stunning natural beauty, ancient cities and kaleidoscopic culture that even before this latest war was little known to the outside world.
It's this city that sits above the clouds, up in the southwestern highlands, and it is just like nowhere else. It is extremely picturesque. Those tall, rammed earth buildings with really intricate stained glass windows. The beach is a really popular place for Yemenis. On Fridays to eat grilled fish, it's a really important feature of life.
Scenes from a previous life. 10 years ago, a civil war began that created what the UN has called the worst humanitarian crisis in the world.
It became a battleground. People need aid across the country, and there's not enough aid being distributed.
In this episode of The Global Jigsaw, we tell the story of 3 ancient cities affected by the war in different ways: Sana'a, Aden and Taiz. We discover what life is like under the Houthis, the so-called government of hotels, the separatists and the snipers. And as always, we unpick the narratives of the warring parties. I'm Krassi Twig, and this is the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring, where we look at the world through the lens of its media, getting past the narratives, the propaganda and the disinformation.
Radio Tehran. Мы не вторгались на территорию Украины.
Western countries are not the international community. That era has finished.
조중 두당 두 나라 최고 영도자 동지들께서는
My family is from these 3 cities. My parents are from Aden, but
with her roots in Yemen, my colleague Soumeya Baksh is just the person in our Middle East team to tell her country's story.
We're now in a state that many Yemenis say is no peace and no war. In 2022, there was a 6-month nationwide truce, and since then, there hasn't been a return to full-scale fighting. The conflict also hasn't been resolved, and so there's a stalemate currently. There have been many rounds of negotiations, and there hasn't been any significant progress. And as the war has gone on and the country has become more divided and there are other actors now on the ground in Yemen, it's becoming increasingly complicated.
It sounds like another one of those frozen conflicts, frozen in its state of destruction and urgent need for aid for millions of people.
The infrastructure has been battered by the conflict. Around half of the country's health facilities are functioning now, which means that many Yemenis, if they need to access medical treatment, they might have to travel abroad. That's not always possible because of the Saudi-led coalition's partial land, air and sea blockade on Yemen. Many people are struggling to afford their daily needs. Everyday life for the average Yemeni is really tough.
How did it come to this? Let's find out more about the history of Yemen. Here's Duncan Stanworth with this fact file.
Despite its ancient roots as the crossroads of Africa, the Middle East and Asia, the modern Republic of Yemen is a relatively new state. It was created after communist South Yemen merged with North Yemen in 1990, following years of strife. Yemen has been in a state of political crisis since 2011, when a wave of protests, inspired by the Arab Spring uprisings, forced President Ali Abdallah Saleh to resign. In the turmoil that followed, the Houthis, a militia supported by Iran, seized much of the north and west of the country, while Saudi-led forces, backed by American weapons, intervened to support the internationally recognized government based initially in Aden in the south. The multi-sided fighting has also seen activity by Al-Qaeda and Islamic State jihadist groups. In 2019, Aden was seized by the separatist Southern Transitional Council, which is supported by the United Arab Emirates. This is why the internationally recognized government is now based in Saudi Arabia. Various parts of the country are controlled by the warring groups, all of which are vying to expand their reach. Last November, the Houthis began attacking ships in the Red Sea, with the stated aim of pressurizing Israel to stop its military campaign in Gaza, which was launched in the aftermath of the Hamas attack on Israel on the 7th of October. The maritime strikes caused disruptions to global trade and prompted US-UK strikes on Houthi targets in Yemen. According to the UN, over 150,000 people have been killed in Yemen and more than 227,000 have died as a result of famine and lack of healthcare facilities. The continuing war triggered one of the world's worst humanitarian crises, with more than 23 million people, 3/4 of the population, in need of aid.
First stop on our tour is the capital Sana'a. It's one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities of the world, home to 2.5 million people.
Sana'a is really rich in history. It has really distinctive architecture. There's the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Sana'a's Old City. And anyone who's seen photos of Sana'a will recognize those tall, rammed earth buildings with really intricate stained glass windows. And in the Old City, there's also what is believed to be the first mosque built outside Mecca and Medina in the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad.
You talk about this beautiful, stunning, very distinctive architecture. What is the impact of the war on it?
These buildings, which are designated as UNESCO World Heritage Sites, have been damaged by the war. They've also been damaged by the floods, so they're really at risk.
2011 was a momentous year for Yemen, just like for many other countries in the Middle East, prompting seismic changes that would transform the region.
In January 2011, as other countries in the Arab world were witnessing Arab Spring protests, thousands of Yemenis came out into the streets, initially protesting the poor economic conditions and corruption, but then they began to call for the downfall of longtime ruler Ali Abdullah Saleh's rule. And Sana'a was the scene of some of the biggest protests. In March 2011, it was also the scene of the most violent crackdown. The Friday of Dignity, when Saleh loyalists opened fire on a protest camp in what was known as Change Square. At least 45 people were killed and hundreds were wounded.
And who are the people who went out to protest? Can you tell me a bit about them?
Yemenis across the country came out into the streets. Women, they were mobilizing, they were setting up camps, running workshops and educating each other. They really had a prominent role in the protests, and some of them were also killed.
3 years later, another wave of protests came about, this time against fuel subsidy cuts. And they brought some unexpected visitors to Sana'a. They call themselves Ansar Allah, or supporters of God. You know them as the Houthis.
The Houthis are based up in Saada, in the far north of Yemen, and they are from the Zaydi Shia sect. They had long felt marginalized by Ali Abdullah Saleh's government. He, in the early 2000s, fought 6 wars against them. But they believe that they have a divine right to rule Yemen. These protests led by the Houthis, it came down into the capital. And what happened then was this really swift takeover of the capital. The army didn't really resist. Suddenly, what Sana'a residents were facing was being ruled by this kind of ragtag militia from the north who were quick to crack down. Over the years, they've increasingly imposed restrictions in areas under their control on freedom of expression. Expressing any kind of criticism of the Houthis on social media is risky. We've seen activists, journalists arrested, also restrictions on minorities and women. They began to instill this atmosphere of fear amongst people living in areas under their control.
So life has changed dramatically for people there.
In many ways, yes. It's very different to other parts of Yemen.
The Houthi takeover of the capital prompted a conflict involving several regional players. We'll tell you more about them in a follow-up episode on Yemen. One of those players, the Saudi-led coalition, put an air, land and sea blockade on the country.
The blockade means that Sana'a airport, which prior to the war was the country's main airport, there are no civilian flights from there now. anyone needing to travel has to make the journey from the Houthi-controlled north to the south to Aden Airport. It's important to remember as well that the most of the population lives in northern Houthi-controlled Yemen. So the blockade has meant restrictions on travel. For the past 2 years, there haven't really been airstrikes, but where there were airstrikes, there were civilian casualties, civilian deaths from airstrikes.
The blockade enforced by Riyadh and its allies led to famine and disease. According to the UN, tens of thousands of people died of preventable causes. Meanwhile, in Sana'a, the Houthis cracked down on independent voices.
Free journalism is definitely very difficult. Since the start of the conflict, over 150 media outlets are said to have been closed down. All parties to the war have reportedly intimidated, threatened, detained journalists. For example, the Akhbar al-Yom newspaper was banned by both the Houthis in the north and the Southern Transitional Council in the south. We have the example of Saida TV, which was Yemen's first privately owned satellite channel, and its offices were raided by the Houthis in 2015 as they raided other offices of media outlets opposed to the group. A lot of these channels transferred their operations abroad. Suhail TV, for example, again, its offices were raided by the Houthis. They're now broadcasting from the Saudi capital, Riyadh. And a Houthi-run court in 2020 sentenced 4 journalists to death for spreading false and malicious information and rumours online, which has been widely condemned by human rights groups.
And how are the Houthis filling that vacuum that they have created?
With their media outlets, the flagship of which is Al Masira TV channel, where you will see speeches by the Houthi leader Abdel Malik al-Houthi being broadcast. You will see rolling footage of these mass pro-Palestinian protests in Houthi-controlled territory. And it's also really what they use to kind of propagate their media narrative. And that narrative is supported by Houthi officials on social media, by the news agency that is controlled by the Houthis. They've really filled that gap with a broad network of media outlets that are propagating their narrative.
And what is the narrative of the Houthis? What are their aims? How do they express them?
They frame themselves, again, as having this divine right to rule, the defenders of Islam, and they portray the government as being sellouts to the West, as having facilitated these external invaders in the form of the Saudi-led coalition, which is led by both Saudi Arabia and the UAE. It's this kind of battle between the Houthis defending this Islamic country against the government, which allowed these, quote, traitors into the country.
And do they find any appeal with that narrative among the population?
This is a conservative Muslim country, and so there is that, but there's also the fact that many people don't believe that they have the divine right to rule and reject that.
Since the start of the Gaza war, the Houthis have gained prominence globally after inflicting major disruption to international shipping with their attacks in the Red Sea. American and British warships have been trying, often in vain, to keep the group in check. Washington was rattled and declared it a global terrorist group. In Sana'a, the Houthis regularly draw huge crowds of supporters.
Since the outbreak of the Israel-Gaza conflict, we've seen these mass rallies in support of Palestinians, where you will see the crowds chanting the Houthi slogan, God is the greatest, death to America, death to Israel, curse upon the Jews, victory to Islam. And that is a slogan that we hear chanted en masse at these marches. Given that people living under Houthi control, as we've said, can't really express opposition to the Houthis, or if they do, they're putting themselves at risk. But certainly in terms of the Houthis' global profile, as we've seen over the past year with their maritime attacks, which they say are in support of Palestinians, we've seen their profile skyrocket. They've positioned themselves as the defenders of Palestinians, where, according to them, governments in the region have failed the Palestinians. For Yemenis domestically, those opposed to the Houthis are very skeptical of the Houthis' stated aims when it comes to carrying out these maritime attacks, because they feel like They're claiming to be defending the rights of Palestinians, while, as many people see in Yemen, violating the rights of Yemenis in areas under their control.
Can you tell me a little bit about that and specifically about the groups of people who are in the Houthis' crosshairs?
For example, religious minorities, the Baha'i minority, members of whom have been forcibly disappeared by the Houthis, and also women have faced increasing restrictions on their freedoms. The Houthis have tried to impose a system of women needing a male guardian in order to travel. In terms of dress, there were reports a few years ago of how they attempted to ban images of women's underwear in clothing shops, which really gives you an idea of how strictly they try to police all aspects of life. They are trying to get women to only wear the long black abaya. They have female members of the Houthi rebels called Zainabiyat who impose Houthi rules on women in areas under their control.
So these are women who are turning on women. What are they like? What's their motivation for this?
They are intimidating. A lot of them are armed. And according to a UN panel of experts on Yemen, the work of the Zainabiyat is to repress and control women in prisons, in professional workspaces, and in public places. They really do enforce Houthi rules pretty strictly.
What is the Houthis' approach towards education for girls and women?
They've attempted to impose gender segregation, for example, in universities. And they have changed aspects of the school curriculum in areas under their control. Now textbooks include stories, for example, about child soldiers, martyrs. They're promoting a narrative in which their heroic fighters are defending Islam and their enemies are seen as sellouts to the Americans and the Saudis.
You are listening to the Global Jigsaw from BBC Monitoring. Let's slide the finger down the map, about 300 kilometers to the southern coast and the scenic views of the interim capital. Around 900,000 people call this place home.
Aden is really a city that draws your eye outwards. You have the sea in front of you, you have the mountains behind you. The beach is a really popular place for Yemenis, for Aden residents to gather at the weekends on Fridays to eat grilled fish. It's a really important feature of life in Aden.
The name Aden in Arabic evokes the image of the Garden of Eden. Just like the laid-back family evenings on the beach its residents enjoyed so much in times of peace. Not so now.
Situation is dire, even though in 2015, because of the Houthi takeover of Sana'a, it became the interim capital. But life there is difficult, and in recent years it's actually become a battleground for a new power struggle between the internationally recognized government and the Southern Transitional Council, which is calling for an independent southern state, and it's backed by the UAE. There's this new power struggle playing out in Aden. And what that means for residents of the city is basically that they're facing poor public services, the currency is in free fall, cost of living is really high. There's a lot of dissatisfaction in Aden.
Presumably lots of people need aid in these situations to survive.
Yeah, people need aid across the country, and there's not enough aid being distributed.
Let's slow down a bit. The picture seems complex enough for a whole region, let alone a single city. Aden is not under Houthi rule. That much is clear. So who's in charge there?
Technically, it's the internationally recognized government, but amongst many Yemenis, they're known as the government of hotels because they're primarily based in hotels in Riyadh and in Cairo.
In a different country?
In a different country. And since 2019, Aden has actually been controlled by the Southern Transitional Council, this body that is calling for an independent southern state. And that has made it very difficult for the Yemeni government to gain a foothold in Yemen and establish itself there.
The internationally recognized government are trying to be in charge from abroad, while there is another governing body, the STC, inside the country. What is the interaction, the dynamic between those two?
Well, it gets even more complicated because in 2022, former President Abdurrabbu Mansour Hadi He announced that he was delegating his powers to this new body that was seen as an attempt to resolve the power struggle between the internationally recognized government and the Southern Transitional Council.
أمام تحقيق شعبنا لطموحاته في بناء يمن جديد.
This 8-member Presidential Leadership Council has representatives from the Southern Separatists within it, but this actually has not resolved the situation. The power struggle is ongoing.
How does the governing happen?
Well, this is the issue. For example, summers in Aden are extremely hot, extremely humid, and you have these really long power cuts. And while residents are complaining about these lengthy power cuts, the government and the Southern Transitional Council are blaming each other for the poor public services, and the situation is just not getting resolved.
And the residents are on the receiving end of this, of course.
Exactly.
What are the main narratives that you see in those sources, presumably from the government and from the STC?
From the government, you'll see a lot of reporting on the violations carried out by the Houthi rebels in areas under their control. And from STC outlets, there will be a lot of criticism of the internationally recognized government for poor public services, for the situation when it comes to the presence of jihadist groups in the south. And also we have to remember that in the east of the country, in the southeast of the country, there are also other groups that are seeking greater autonomy. These are oil-rich provinces that want more control over their revenues. So there are a lot of groups in the south that are kind of harnessing public dissatisfaction with the situation to gain their own support bases.
So it sounds like this separatist tendency is there and it's not new.
It's not new because Yemen was previously divided between North Yemen and South Yemen. This is kind of a resurgence of that deep division.
The country is not really a one united country.
It's not. It's deeply divided. And there's even 2 rival central banks, for example, which really gives you an idea of how divided the country is.
And what is the ultimate aim of the rulers of Aden?
Internationally recognized government wants to be reinstated in the capital, Sana'a, and for the Houthis to be rolled back. And the Southern Transitional Council would like an independent southern state.
About halfway between the 2 capitals, high up in the mountains, we find another city, nestled in breathtaking natural beauty. In Taiz, nearly 1 million people have been fending for themselves during this conflict.
It is so beautiful. It's this city that sits above the clouds, up in the southwestern highlands of Yemen, and it is just like nowhere else. It is extremely picturesque. It was the cultural capital of Yemen, and it is just a very distinctive city.
Tell me a little bit more about the culture and the kind of things you love about it.
It's accessed by these incredibly precarious mountain roads, where you look out of the car window and you just see this sheer drop. There are these incredible views of the mountain ranges. It's just a very scenic city. The population is relatively educated. At the beginning of the siege, a lot of these professionals, lawyers, doctors, teachers, took up arms and went to the front lines to fight off the Houthi rebels. They're kind of outward-looking, largely educated, and the city of Taiz has resisted the Houthi rebels for 9 years now.
Taiz has a special place in the country's recent history.
It was known as the cradle of the revolution that led to Ali Abdullah Saleh standing down. But now, because of this siege that began shortly after the conflict escalated, the Saudi-led coalition launched an aerial bombing campaign against the Houthis. And in April 2015, the Houthis surrounded the city of Taiz. And that siege has gone on ever since. Many residents of Taiz feel that they've been fending off the rebels for 9 years, and there hasn't been much respite.
Just trying to imagine people living for 9 years under siege. What does that mean for these people?
Taiz became known as the city of snipers because of the prevalence of Houthi snipers. It was really dangerous just going about your daily life. There's also been shelling of residential neighborhoods. So that's the violence. And because of the siege, hospitals lack medical supplies. When it comes to people with chronic illnesses, they just don't have the facilities to be able to treat these patients. And just in terms of aid, in terms of water, daily life there is just really difficult because of the siege.
A lot of the daily chores under siege are done by women. Where do you think is the toughest to be a woman out of these 3 cities we're talking about?
There are a lot of women who have left to be the breadwinners because the men of their family have either been killed or forcibly disappeared. We have women's groups who have come together to support each other because their husbands, their brothers, their fathers are being detained. But then we also are looking at the restrictions on women in areas under Houthi control. So it's a tough one. I would say probably Houthi-controlled areas. And there was also a UN report in 2020 which documented incidents of the Houthis raping women and girls. And there were also incidents of rape by UAE-backed forces in the south of the country.
And when you spoke about curriculum in Sana'a, you mentioned how it is changing. How is schooling at all possible in Taiz, given the security risks?
It's tough, as in all aspects of life in Taiz, but a lot of teachers are being very resourceful. And so you'll see these classrooms in very rudimentary conditions. They're doing the best with what little they have. But obviously, it's really difficult to be any continuity in education when you're under that level of violence, that level of deprivation.
And what does that mean specifically for girls?
Even before the war, half of Yemeni women were married by the age of 18. And now, because of the conflict and because of the decreasing choices that women have, we're seeing the age of Yemeni women getting married drop further.
We won't leave Taiz without checking the narratives. As you would expect, a blame game is going on, courtesy of the Houthis on the one hand, who keep the city under siege, and on the other, the internationally recognized government, which is supposed to be in charge here.
The government, when it talks about events in Taiz, it focuses primarily on Houthi violations and the impact of the Houthi siege. And when it comes to the Houthi narrative on Taiz, they're talking about fighting mercenaries there. So when they talk about clashes and shelling, they say that they're targeting mercenaries. But then we do see these incidents where residential neighborhoods are shelled, there are civilian casualties, and sometimes the Houthis and the government will trade blame or deny or minimize the number of civilian casualties.
It's not just the government and the Houthis. The picture here gets further complicated by the presence of other actors with their own agenda.
There is the presence of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and the militants have been seen on the front line, but the coalition and the Yemeni army deny that they've been cooperating with Al-Qaeda in fighting the Houthis, but we have seen those militants on the front lines.
We'll leave the jihadist chapter to part 2 of this mini-series. Let's stay with the residents of Taiz who've been surviving under siege for 9 years. Information can be a lifeline there. Where do they get it from?
Again, from the popular regional outlets and domestic TV channels, domestic news websites, but also social media, WhatsApp groups where people will share articles and things like that. But primarily, social media is a really popular way to get news.
Is that where you get most of your information?
I do, and also I speak to people on the ground there. I was introduced at the beginning of the war to a local activist, and since then he's become really my eyes and ears on the ground in Taiz. You know, we've kept in touch for the past 9 years. Whenever there's a development, he will share how it makes him feel or what the significance is for him.
يعني الآن أنت لو نشوف موضوع الحصار بشكل شامل.
He's really a voice that makes me understand what the impact is on the everyday resident in Taiz.
I'm just curious, when you talk to one person over a long period of time, does the mood change? Does the hopefulness change?
The thing is, he is an extremely resilient and optimistic person, and he doesn't tend to complain. On the rare occasion where you feel that he's feeling a bit pessimistic, you really realize that things are really tough there. Yemenis in general, even when I speak to my family, they really just want to get on with their lives. They want to fall in love and get married and all of the things. But the war really weighs on them, and you can really see that. Over the years, I've kind of seen the initial feeling that this wasn't going to last very long, and then the gradual realization that this is going on, and now we're 9 years in, and what does that mean for people's lives and what it means for people's futures.
Thank you to Sumaya Baksh for opening a window into life in these 3 Yemeni cities stuck in a limbo of prolonged conflict. In part 2, we'll look at the regional powers involved here to understand who wants what and what are the chances of peace for Yemen. Thanks to the production team, Sumaya Baksh, Krista Shaturi and Elchin Suleymanov, as well as to the sound engineer John Boland and our editor Judy King. And thank you for listening. From me, Krassi Twig.